I've long defined myself as the person who will go and do it. So my late best friend, Karina, shout outs to Karina forever. She would always tell me, don't talk about it, be about it. And so starting LEAD Filipino, starting Fancy Heads, my social enterprise, and all the other projects I want to have my hands in, for me, Daniel, it has long been the virtue of just going and doing it. You can read, you can prepare, you can study, you can save. At some point, you need to apply your knowledge, maybe fail a few times, retool, and go back out swinging, because that's the only way that you're going to see those small wins, and then the small wins start accumulating, and then you're like, whoops, I took 10 steps back. That was a misstep. That was a bad investment. But for me, I could not sit and theorize about what advancement or what bringing an idea from my head into reality. I couldn't just leave it in my head and talk about it all day and philosophize and leave it there. I think that would be a disservice to myself.
Welcome back to another episode of High Value Discussions. My guest for this episode is the nationally recognized Filipina American, a nonprofit executive and the visionary founder and CEO behind LEAD Filipino, a groundbreaking organization leading civic education, cultural organizing, and health and equity across California, Texas, and Nevada. She's spoken at the White House, partnered with Fortune 500 companies, and has been honored as the Silicon Valley 40 Under 40 and Woman of Influence. She has been on the front lines of voter turnout campaigns, racial equity initiatives, and cross-sector coalitions that have reshaped on how communities engage with power. Her work is featured in academic publications and national spotlights, but even more impressive is her heart for the people. In this episode, we talk everything from the grassroots organization to national policy, the identity of being a Filipino American leader, and what it truly means to build movements that last. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Dr. Angelica Cortez.
When I think about who I was before these roles, LEAD Filipino, working for the state legislature, working at San Jose City Hall, I grew up in Pittsburgh. If you think of Oakland and you go 45 more minutes east, you land in Pittsburgh, solidly middle-class community, working families. And I always tell my friends, I knew that I was gay, but I didn't understand what that meant when I was in second grade. And it was innocent. I liked attention I had a crush on a fourth grader. I was in second grade in the same class with her sister. And this fourth grader would tease me and call me Angelica Pickles from the Rugrats show. And at 7 years old, it's so innocent. And my appreciation in wanting that attention and saying, yes, I am Angelica Pickles. So I think that's a major theme, because I did not come out till I was 25. So knowing that and being raised in a blended family, my mom married my stepdad when I was 5 years old. He had my two stepsisters from his previous marriage. So they would come visit every other weekend. And in our blended family, we had a lot of structure and cultural values. With that came being a Filipino family, church on Sundays, a very devoutly Catholic upbringing. I was extremely involved in my church. I was in choir, I was a lector, and also went through what we called, our Catholic faith formation or Sunday school. And going through even Catholic faith formation and being involved in activities, I always had little crushes on other girls when I was singing in choir or in the youth activities, but I knew that it was not accepted. And I struggled with that. So despite even having deep ingrained cultural values, both on my mom and dad's side. So my mom is a mixed Filipina. She's also Guamanian or Pacific Islander, Dutch and Irish. My dad is Filipino. I don't talk much about my biological father. He was in the picture, but not so much. He suffered and continues to suffer from mental illness. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia. That's the reason my mom had to make decisions about my and her safety. So for all intents and purposes, my stepdad is my dad. He raised me. But my biological father, also Filipino. And he continues to try to do the best that he can. But it's his story when I think about where systems have failed us and where mental health and substance abuse were also big themes in my upbringing. I think about his story. I think about my family struggles, economic hardships, long lapses of unemployment, housing instability, food insecurity. And I look to where I am now, and it's, really no question as to why I work in public systems and why I'm in community organizing and why I've dedicated my life to helping others build their power. So being deep in, cultural values and having the structure of family, I went through sort of my own journey. And when I went to San Jose State, it was really that coming together of coming out in my early 20s, experiencing love for the first time, having my heart broken, and taking one too many political science classes. I originally was an English major. I wanted to actually work for a publishing house. As a kid, I had a very active and wild imagination where I would draw for hours. I loved drawing, painting, sculpting clay. And I think it was also because of my early years I am my mom's only child. So a lot of it was I spent time with adults. I had to keep myself busy. I created realities with characters and different storylines. I drew comic strips. I loved Garfield. And because I hung out with a lot of adults, I also enjoyed The Far Side. I don't know if you remember the Far Side comic series, definitely adult humor. Like, what did I think was funny about that? But yeah, all of those kind of influences coming together led me to want to pursue English. But it was actually during Obama's historic presidential run that I found myself very curious about, what does a senator do? What is community organizing out of the South Side of Chicago? And I was just so fascinated about, at the time, the imagery that was being shown as a part of his campaign. Symbolism of hope, of change, of desire, of something different. Because I didn't have a political lens at that time, I didn't really know why I was drawn to it. But it was the coming together of student activism at San Jose State, the economic downturn and the recession, being involved with the Filipino American student organization on San Jose State's campus called Akbayan. I was a student officer. I was their community and political affairs chair, and being in my first same-sex relationship. So all of these pieces came together that I still consider my adult awakening in terms of my politicization. Remembering who I was, learning about the history of not just the Filipino American struggle and contributions to the American society, but learning about even the deeper relational history around organizing and impact with the Filipino and Latino communities as agricultural workers in the Valley of Heart's Delight here in Silicon Valley. Learning about coalition building, the civil rights era, revolutionary leaders that we still regard today. And then you have this opportunity for me to to fully love and be in my first same-sex relationship. And there was a lot happening, I'd say, in my early 20s that precipitated, a lot of the interests that I would continue to say yes to, that were justice focused and equity oriented. And yeah, I think back to just that path and that journey. And really it's just, I think of streams flowing into one river. And I think of the subterranean current of a river. Rivers on their surface are choppy anyhow. But just like the Whitewater Rapids, everything sort of clashing together and coming together and at the end flowing in the same direction. So you had like this tension with my own faith and growing up Catholic and thinking, am I going to hell because I have attraction and love for a woman? And then grappling with that and hiding big parts of myself from my family. The whole aspect of changing my major and venturing into political science, which I consider the only true science, where talks of politics were discouraged in my household. So I have very different views than nearly everyone in my family. We know now what we talk about during holiday dinners. They know very, very intimately where I stand on certain issues. We don't need to be disrespectful, though.
Yeah.
At 19 and 20, when I was like mad at everyone, I did not know that. I got into like full blown like screaming matches with my grandma. My grandma exercises her civic duty into her 80s. And so I never questioned where the fire comes from anyway.
Yeah.
So you have that. And then you have this other piece, these pillars of my identity being built during these formative years. The third piece being understanding the blood running through my veins as a mixed Filipina who had not at that point gone to the Philippines. So really learning about my people in an American context, even in the Philippines. So I got really deep into learning my history here and abroad in the Philippines, social, political. And I, as I mentioned earlier, I love drawing. Calling myself an artist is another kind of identity I grapple with because I have such profound respect for artists who I have just deep respect for artists, and it is not a primary identity I lead with, but I do love the arts, visual arts. So
I would call you an artist.
Thank you.
I feel like when people put an idea together and it's flourishing, that is artistry.
Thank you. Thank you.
That awakening at such a young age, at 25 or your early 20s, that in itself is something to say praise about, because people now, whether they're 25 and up, like I'm 30 years old, and people are struggling now, like especially with their mental health. And I think that's probably what influenced you heavily was from your biological father. Was it that? And also anything added to that you saw? Because as you were entering these doors, as you were meeting these people, you had more exposure. You got to see, oh, it's not just the household that I dealt with, it's everywhere.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think about, so in my advanced studies, we looked a lot at cognitive behavioral theories. This is where we would look at group dynamics, in-group and out-group relationships, how one is motivated, how we motivate another or a larger group of people to take collective action. So in my advanced studies, looking at meaning and how we interpret life's adversities, life's successes, our achievements, wonderful relationships, negative relationships, mentors, meaningful moments. At the end of the day, life will happen for us, but the meaning that we make around that, the attributions that we assign to, take, for example, me not studying for a final exam. I get a C minus. And instead I blame the instructor. The teaching was bad. My performance in this score is not a reflection of my lack of effort. The professor was bad. And then I walk away saying to myself, because the subject was maybe math. I'm like, oh, I'm just, not good at math. I've never had good teachers. So that is a snapshot of how powerful attributions are. And when I think about attributions related to my personal story, because I don't talk about my biological father as much as I should. And no one's ever discouraged me. My mom knows that's my story to tell. His brothers and sisters have never tried to silence me telling that part of my life. And it's something that is painful because it's such a depth of vulnerability. But I'm pushing myself to reframe that mental illness is something we need to normalize. He could not and cannot help his condition. But to your point, subconsciously, how did my exposure at a young age where our safety was threatened, his paranoia, his violence, his self-medication through substance abuse. And I'm not saying this is exclusive to Filipino families, but the dynamic of not trying to show weakness, not trying to expose imperfection to anybody outside of the family unit, so they hid his illness. And my dad is that uncle that everyone laughs about. Because when he wouldn't take his medication, he unfortunately would lose sight of reality. And to a lucid person, they're like, oh, that's uncle. But that uncle is my dad. So embracing that he continues to do the best that he can, but that earliest influence, I think, is a needle that I thread when I look at the positions I have chosen, the opportunities I have said yes to. Daniel, they've all been interconnected within the realm of health and human services.
These are problems. It almost feels like it'll always be there. And I don't like saying that out loud, but that is a very, very tough problem to solve. Mm-hmm. But in your perspective, what do you think that we should do when it comes to education, when it comes to resources? Like, what is the best thing that we could possibly do here?
So that is something I still sit with, because I just developed and led a training last week with community health workers in Santa Clara County, specifically on the issue of intergenerational dynamics and cultural context with Asian American Pacific Islander communities related to mental and behavioral health. So you have generational clashes that happen where you have the traditional and the modern. So traditional viewpoints around the family unit, if you're the eldest son, you are the authority, you have decision-making power. If you are a young woman in a traditional belief system of an Asian American Pacific Islander household or family, you are expected to be subservient, servile, docile, obedient, and how those viewpoints clash with the modern way of being in America, where we know this economic environment we're in requires two working partners, where you do have situations that grind up against and challenge gender norms in the household, where maybe if we're talking a man and a woman partnership, maybe the woman is the CEO and brings home the bread. And how does that flip sort of a power dynamic based on a social understanding? When both people are playing on the same team, we don't need to compete with each other when the world is swinging at us left and right outside. But those are dynamics. The belief systems around the family unit, so the collectivist mentality versus the individualistic mentality that we see in America, where an individualist experiences, you're praised for being independent. You're praised for being high achieving. You're praised for being very self-starting. The collectivist mentality is you do not air out our dirty laundry. You do not ask for help, because if you reveal anything to even an aunt or an uncle who is outside of this group, you are betraying the family. And you're also betraying the family if you move to the East Coast to pursue your own happiness. I'm being a little facetious here, but it shows up and it looks different based on, of course, family dynamics, different experiences, but it goes back to what I described around attributions. So in the collectivist mentality, when you look at, immigrant families who have immigrated here and they're all living together and they're sharing resources, and what that does to when you emphasize loyalty and duty to the collective, like how dare you prioritize yourself and your well-being over the needs of this family. And then within that, the other sort of behavioral piece that I describe is visibility versus invisibility. And that goes to your question. The visibility versus invisibility. So when you are emphasizing the duty and loyalty and the impervious shell of a perfect family, but someone in that unit is suffering from mental illness and they need help that involves trained professionals. Maybe they need medication. In the instance of mental illness, yes, they need medication. If there is addiction and substance abuse, that's also a part of that conversation. They need rehabilitation. But if that family is not wanting to seek help because of the shame it could bring upon the family, you have situations where I could think of at least 4 in my immediate experience with my families where I have relatives who have or had developmental disabilities, mental health issues, and instead of seeking adult day programs or service providers that could support and take some of that responsibility and share in that with the family who is not suited, not trained, and clearly lacks the knowledge to care for this person and their needs. Instead, they put them in a bedroom. And honestly, they're just not forgotten. They're fed and they're cared for. But I have a cousin on my biological father's side who has a developmental disability, and he sits in his bedroom all day. So when I think about what more can be done, there's a lot of unlearning that will clash with generational attitudes, with society's expectations, with comfort levels. And this is why I'm such a strong advocate for culturally responsive outreach and culturally responsive education. It's not to be exclusionary. I know that these particular descriptions nowadays have attracted a lot of ire and a lot of skepticism, but it means something different when I'm trying to work with a Filipina elder who looks at me, and then there's this instant exchange of trust. And she opens up because I understand when she says shame or hiya, which is a Tagalog word for shame. Walang hiya. I don't want shame brought upon my family. And that's the reason I'm not going in for my regular medical screenings, from cervical cancer screenings or mammograms. I'm scared of what I might learn. So reducing stigma, but doing so by fostering trust. I wish someone like me knew my dad's family during the time when he was a young adult and the symptoms were setting in. Maybe someone at church. So that training that I just described to you, that's all for community health educators who are the trusted, young folks, aunties and uncles who are at churches, who work in community-based settings, who would be able to sit next to my grandma at church on Sunday and say, hey, I love and care for you and your family. I want to be helpful. Can we talk more about ways to support your son? I know someone who is very trustworthy. In fact, they go to the 12 p.m. Mass. So that person who could be the linkage, because to approach an old school grandmother and tell them your son needs help, they hear, my son's not crazy. How dare you call my son crazy? And then that's the end of the conversation. So it's a lot of unlearning, I think, in our country right now, as we see sort of this embrace and mental well-being and wellness is becoming a part of the mainstream. We also have to be careful because part of becoming the mainstream could mean cottage industries of this is what well-being and wellness looks like, but we know that it needs to be responsive to the particular communities. It's not a standardized practice. And when we say wellness, that's drinking your 8 glasses of water a day. That's making sure you're exercising. That's cutting the cigarettes and the drinking. That's very different than mental illness. And I think those two terms get conflated in the mainstream and it creates further confusion. But it's good because you see corporations, you see employing organizations promoting wellness and self-care to prevent burnout and fatigue, which when you think of burnout and fatigue, these could be predictors of particular behaviors that lead to smoking, drinking, different behaviors that one could describe as self-harm, not sleeping, partying too much, burning from both ends. How can those activities lead to potential breakdowns, panic attacks, cognitive overload, so nervous breakdowns? So it's a lot of unlearning.
While you were speaking, there's like a specific word that just kind of came to my mind, and that has to do with leadership. Mm-hmm. And usually that skill set does take time. And we were kind of talking off air how, sometimes we do great things and sometimes we don't have the confidence to realize how useful we are to all the things that we do and to the people that we are useful for. And while you were speaking, I thought that I was like, wow, she's very, very useful. There's those people who kind of just talk about it, they'll post about it, so on and so forth. But it's a very different thing when they're diving head first into it and trying to solve the problem. So do you recognize that within yourself of how useful you are?
I appreciate that. I've long defined myself as the person who will go and do it. So my late best friend, Karina, shout outs to Karina forever. She would always tell me, don't talk about it, be about it. And so starting LEAD Filipino, starting Fancy Heads, my social enterprise, and all the other projects I want to have my hands in. For me, Daniel, it has long been the virtue of just going and doing it. You can read, you can prepare, You can study, you can save. At some point, you need to apply your knowledge, maybe fail a few times, retool, and go back out swinging, because that's the only way that you're going to see those small wins. And then the small wins start accumulating. And then you're like, whoops, I took 10 steps back. That was a misstep. That was a bad investment. But for me, I could not sit and theorize about what advancement or what bringing an idea from my head into reality. I couldn't just leave it in my head and talk about it all day and philosophize and leave it there. I think that would be a disservice to myself. So I've long defined, in terms of my self-concept, as someone who goes and does it.
And I think that's leading by example too, because as these young leaders, they need somebody to look up to, not just like how they speak. Because I know nowadays it's like we look at people and like how they speak or how they conduct themselves. It's like, yeah, but what do they do on a day-to-day basis?
Yes.
I don't care about what they say. I care about what they do. So in your instance, I feel like when somebody's kind of looking at you, and you are that mentor figure without a doubt, and I feel like when they approach you, they are going to get that example, but it is very, very relentless, and it's almost tiresome. You said the word burnout earlier. Have you ever faced that with everything that you've faced and started and created? I mean, that word burnout, it does come, but at the same time, I feel like the purpose is so big. It's almost like, how could we burn out? Yes, it's tiresome, hectic, chaotic, but the purpose is just too big to stop.
Yeah. I'll say no, and I'll explain more. There are days where I would much rather be at a music festival, where I'd much rather be planning my next trip to the Philippines or Southeast Asia. But I know that if I am not tapped in and focused and disciplined, that people's lights will get turned off and they will not have money for groceries. So the other thing too is I'd like to share a story about when I knew that I met my purpose. I was 20 years old. So it was around that period, that era, where I was in my first same-sex relationship. I had just changed my major to political science. And I was very excited about that. English was like, after the first year, I did not feel challenged. I did not feel enlivened. And then I had taken a series of different civil rights, political theory, and community organizing focused, social justice oriented classes, one of them being Filipino American experience. And it was during the time that I served, as I mentioned, as the community and political affairs chair for Akbayan, the Filipino American student organization at San Jose State. And I helped to co-produce a conference for almost 230 Filipino American first generation youth from the Eastside Union High School District. James Lick, YB, Silver Creek, Independence, all schools that I know you know. And these kids, we paid for the buses. I remember distinctively, there were 12 buses that came to San Jose State's campus, and we filled the outdoor amphitheater. Freshmen, sophomore, juniors, and seniors, these kids, we were going to teach them how to fill out the FAFSA. We were going to show them what it looked like to select college classes for a semester. We were going to engage them in topics around knowing their rights. Because we had at the time one of our community members, a Filipino high school student, who had a little sack of weed on him and ultimately had a run-in with the police. And he continued his advocacy around understanding what your rights are when you're in that particular setting. We led workshops around understanding the Filipino American experience, our historic contributions. At the time, a big campaign we were working on was restorative justice for Filipino World War II veterans. So the fervor of 230 plus students filling that amphitheater, clamoring through the halls of San Jose State to attend their workshops, hearing them chant talks about people power. I remember wanting that feeling again because I felt alive. My vibration was so high. And I didn't know at the time what that meant. Like, what was that? Do I just like producing events? Was it about being in a powerful, energizing crowd? I didn't know. What that was, though, was, I'd say, that spark that lit ablaze my activism work. It was about organizing around a shared purpose and moving in a collective direction. And at the time, it was to tell our students, look, you don't need to go the 4-year route. However, you have multiple pathways. Whether or not you go the trades route, you go the 2-year route and you transfer because that's where your pocketbook is and that's what your family can do. But reinforcing these messages that maybe they weren't hearing at home. And I felt like, damn, that's what impact looks like. There were actually, I posted a video the other day because my friend who was studying broadcast journalism at the time did a whole feature on that conference. It was called the Raising Awareness Amongst Filipinos Conference. She did a feature through San Jose State's broadcast journalism school. It aired on Spartan TV. So it's this grainy kind of old footage. And there I am, 20 years old, weird haircut, looking real young. And in my interview, and it's also playing clips of all the kids and just the excitement. I talk about how we're touching first generation in America, where their parents are navigating systems that they didn't necessarily come up in, that were not designed for us. How are we being positive influences and shaping that they know they have options? And there were at least 4 students that attended that conference that when I posted that video responded to the video because it just kept getting reshared. And they were like, that conference changed my life. And I had no idea. One of them is at UNLV and she works in student affairs out in Vegas. I was like, Rachel, you were at that conference. She was like, that exact one. It changed my life. And then another gentleman who is up in Washington State and really does a lot around public policy advocacy, but also in higher education, responded to the story and said, I was there too. No way, that's wild. And it's so gratifying, but I don't do this for gratification. But that was dope. Because at 20, I knew I wanted to keep doing whatever that was. I was like, I'm not necessarily an event coordinator, but whatever that was. And now I understand that to be movement building. Bringing up topics, creating a space and a place where our people can dialogue, where they can emote, where they can feel, where it's participatory. It's not hierarchical, and I'm directing you on what you should feel, think, do, and say. I just want you to think.
That's the cherry on top. Like you said, those things, it feels good. You don't do it for gratification, but it is a great cherry on top.
It was very heartening. And these particular individuals, one of the young ladies that's featured in the video, she added me on Instagram. I'm like, I wonder what she's up to, because I'm going to say she might have been 15 or 16 in that video. And she had such fire. She was raising her left fist, at that age and saying, we as the youth, we need to exercise our voices. We need to vote. At 16, I wasn't saying that. At 16, at 18, I was like, wait, did I miss? The polls closed? Oh, well. So I wonder what she's up to as well. I should send her a note.
Isn't that crazy though? Like the difference. The
Mm-hmm.
difference is like even back then, you go like when I'm seeing the kids now who are like so knowledgeable and their
Yes.
execution and the way they're speaking and like also educating others as well to participate. I'm like,
Yeah.
man, what the heck was I doing when I was a kid, man? It's kind of, it's, it's sad,
I
you know?
agree. I agree. But I also think we needed to, because I think we're almost of that same generation where I truly didn't understand the utility or function of text messaging.
Yeah.
So I was a late adopter, having a little iPhone. I still held the iPhone with the iPod, and I carried both devices together up till 2016.
Yeah.
And then one day, one of my homegirls was like, you can use your phone as the iPod. What? So we were out there living. It wasn't through the lens where we had our phone mediating everything and how we were receiving and experiencing a moment.
Yes.
Which, when I think about just everyone recording nowadays, and you don't know if you'll end up on a TikTok reel, you don't know what someone's clipping out of context. We are in a whole different, we are constantly existing in different planes. And each plane has a different set of rules.
Yeah.
Because you could show up one way in a digital space and claim your digital equity. But I can't tell you how many people I've interacted with online and then I meet them in person and it's a completely different experience. And I'm like, there's truly no proxy for the in-person relationship building and cultivation. And I agree with you. The young folks, the Gen Alphas and the Gen Zs, we always have something to learn from each other. Wisdom to impart, lessons to share, insights to amplify.
My mentor would always notify me on when you see somebody of, say, status or somebody who has accomplished so much, ask who their mentor is.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes even when we're young, we see athletes, artists, actresses, or so on and so forth, parents, friends. Well, we get influenced by something or someone.
Mm-hmm.
But as we get older, it's almost like that word influence changes into like, say, mentors.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had a lot of great mentors along the way, but I've always had this one mentor who really, really dissected me and who's very true to me. And then hearing you speak, I can tell without a doubt that you either had a mentor or mentors.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know who they are, but I can guarantee you that they are very, very proud of you. Who were your mentors? And were they either say that you never met or were you at a close distance from them where you could always pick their brain?
I think a mix of the two. One mentor, I call her my second mom. Her name is Patricia Gardner. She lives in San Jose. She ran the Silicon Valley Council of Nonprofits for nearly 20 years. So she combines campaign strategy with public policy and advocacy, a deep, deep understanding of politics and power, local and state government, but has such a fiery heart for the nonprofit health and human services sector. So she hired me right out of my internship at San Jose City Hall. I was interning with the vice mayor of San Jose. And in my interview with her and the manager at the time, the manager was leading the interview and Patricia would throw in questions here and there, just her little bombs. She didn't look at me once throughout the whole interview, just looked down at my resume. So the thing about Patricia is she is regarded as, in this region in Silicon Valley, as well as across the state and country, as a incredibly savvy political and policy focused community organizer. Of course, she's retired now, but working for her in that interview process, which I thought I bombed, she asked me a question. I don't remember the question. I should follow up with her. But whatever it was, it elicited a response from me about my intentions and my pursuit to do more within the Filipino community. 5 years later, I would start LEAD Filipino. But when I left that office, and I was like, well, that was a terrible interview, because Patricia said in that interview, we never hire anybody who has not interned here first. And I was like, well, I didn't intern here. Thanks. Daniel, by the time I got home, Patricia had already called all of my references. And she offered me the job later that day. And she would later tell me it was because of my ardent commitment to what I wanted to do for the Filipino community that set me apart in that interview. And I was 22 years old. But I worked for her for almost 4 years and started as a policy assistant, worked my way up to the level of a coordinator. One of the first campaigns I worked on with her was the mayor of the city of San Jose at the time wanted to cut funding because we were facing budget cuts. But his idea to balance the budget at the time was to cut millions of dollars from senior nutrition sites and the nonprofits that provided the Meals on Wheels, the transport, to take from the seniors and to not take from maybe administrative fees and, other areas that had lesser of a human impact. Because when you think of seniors, many of them, that is their only activity. We're talking low-income seniors too. That social outing, that lunch hour, that could be the only meal they have all day, and they stretch it. That's their break from their isolation. It is social. It helps them with their movement. So that was the first campaign I worked on, and we mobilized over 200 nonprofit voices to basically pack the San Jose City Hall chambers, and we cut out hearts in the whole campaign out of construction paper, and the whole campaign was Have a Heart for Seniors. And so we organized the testimony. We brought seniors from Catholic Charities, from Asian Americans for Community Involvement, from UI Kai, which is a senior housing nonprofit out of Japantown in San Jose. And we had seniors go up there and share what it would mean if the funding was cut from their program. And after every comment that was given, they would rip the heart and leave it at the dais. And so that's who I was trained under. Working for Patricia Gardner for 4 years, and the unlearning that came with working for her. She is a woman of Irish heritage. She is married to a gentleman named Pete, who is a proud Mexican American Politico himself. So I always would tease her like, Patty G, you think you're Latina, huh? You act like you're Latina. So kind of being raised in my formative professional years and mentored by the two of them. There is not one Latino or Latina elected official across this country that they do not know. How do they not know? How do they know all these people? And working, under her tutelage, we would go to different city and county meetings with county agency heads, elected county supervisors, city council members of all the cities in the area, because what the organization did was we represented the interests and the well-being of nonprofit health and human service providers. So when you think of after-school programs, you think of youth gang violence prevention, next-door solutions for domestic violence survivors and families, senior nutrition, civic education, clinics, some of the, community-based hospitals we represented and organized for the interests of all the nonprofit health and human service providers in this region. Yeah. And she would tell me, because we would go to meetings and I would stay quiet the whole time. Maybe we were meeting with the chief of staff for an elected or the city council member themselves. I would stay quiet the whole meeting. I would take copious notes. I would observe. I would follow, because I had to analyze budget memos. We would follow particular items and issues. And then on the drive back to the office, I would just unload. Did you notice this? There was a gap here. She said this, but it's not adding up. And after I think that happening one too many times, finally Patty G was like, why don't you say it in the meeting? And I realized that I had such hardened views around respect for authority because I was young. I was 23, 24, sitting across from the vice mayor of San Jose, right next to Patricia as she ran the meeting. And I learned also, Daniel, at that young age, not to pedestal these people because they are our next door neighbors. They were elected to serve our interests. And Patty G treated them as such. She wasn't like idolizing them. She was having straightforward conversations about policy needs and the pain of our people, low income, most vulnerable, pushed to the margins. And so after one too many instances where I would bring up all these insights on the ride home after the fact, she was like, use your voice. And that memory is like seared into my brain and into my heart. I wasn't raised in a household that told me necessarily, especially when there's a perceived authority sitting across the table, the vice mayor, the mayor of San Jose, 12th largest city in the country, use my voice. So from that point, I sure did. It took some conditioning, but that goes back to my point around attributions. If I'm attributing that I use my voice, that I know what I'm talking about, that obviously I look like I'm 23 years old. I was 23 years old, but I know what I'm talking about as well. My experiences are important too. I represent particular demographics that they are making and shaping local policies and budget decisions on and about. So the fact that I'm at that table, I better say something.
Obviously, you've gained so much knowledge and wisdom from her that you wanted to almost take and tweak and polish it in your own way.
Yeah.
And then when you started yours, what were some of the lessons and the guidance that she gave you that you took into your nonprofit, but you tweaked it into your own little flavor?
So I continue to call her till this day. Patty G is my second mom and a trusted confidant. Whether or not we're talking personal now or professional guidance, I have complete and utter trust in the advice, the perspective, and the opinions that she gives me. So initially when I started my nonprofit and I told her, I have this idea. But again, my cultural beliefs around honoring perceived authorities of community. So there were some older Filipinos and Filipinas that had been running things informally, right? But social organizations, civic groups, they were the power brokers that folks in community, whether or not they were elected leaders or other civic leaders, would go to get a pulse of or a read on the Filipino community. So I went to these particular individuals with my idea. I want to start this organization to do these things, to increase our civic literacy, to be culturally responsive, to develop grassroots leadership. And I was told by all these different, I don't want to call them gatekeepers, but they were also just guardians that were very comfortable with the status quo. I have this idea. I want to start an org. Do I have your blessing? And one of them literally told me, you are going to step on a landmine if you do this. What? How can I step on a landmine when I don't see anything else that exists, such as what I am proposing? So I went back to Patty G. Hey, I don't know if people will support this. I'm getting this type of feedback. It's kind of negative. And she was like, look, you just need to go do it. Stop talking to me about it. And that was the same advice that my late best friend Karina told me, because I'd ask her at least once a week, let's go to happy hour. Let's go get drinks. Drinks are on me. I want to tell you about my continuing idea around what I want to do, the first event I want to hold, how I want to grow this. And Karina finally one day was like, don't talk about it, be about it. And I told Patty G, well, I mean, I'm getting not negative feedback, but I also don't feel like it's warm. It's sort of lukewarm. She was like, you need to go get your people and you need to go do something. And that's exactly what I did. I called 5 others, Karina being one of them, 5 other Filipina peers that I knew were working in political or policy focused spaces or had a heart for justice and civics. So one of the other kind of co-founding organizers, I'll say, I met her because she was testifying at the city of Milpitas at their library commission. And she was basically decrying the fact that they did not have children's books in Tagalog, despite Filipinos, as you know, being the largest demographic in Milpitas. And I was like, who is she? I need her to be a part of this movement. Because for some people, Daniel, you have to convince them. You need to be civically involved. The decisions that these folks are making are going to impact our fees, the quality of our roads, the amount of streetlights we have, library hours, public art. And they're like, well, what's in it for me? So sometimes part of that learning and part of that relationship building has to be getting folks to kind of widen their aperture, widen your lens to see that we live in an interconnected society. So the what's in it for me, that applies maybe in other corporate settings and other contexts, but in social change, I'll spend time and I'll explain it to people, but it's much easier when someone just understands the vision and you can move out from there. And that was Jessica Page, who we lovingly called J Area, testifying at Milpitas, telling them about themselves.
When I was conducting my research on you and like the time that you put in your nonprofit, the growth that you put into it and all the things that you were telling me off air as well. And I said to you, I feel like you are the perfect person when it comes to providing that information and wisdom down to those youth. If somebody was tugging on your shirt and asking you those quality questions about how to start a nonprofit,
Sure.
What kind of information do you think you would pass down to them?
Yeah, I'd ask if they have a good hour or 2 to sit for story time.
Yeah.
Nothing about starting my nonprofit organization, LEAD Filipino, was overnight. It was 10 years. And I'm still on the final weeks of transitioning out of my 9-to-5 to run this organization, to run it up. Let's do this. How did I start it? What were the initial steps that I took? I worked in the nonprofit world. I worked for organizations that aligned with my own personal mission and vision. So I worked in health and human services. I was a student of political science. I worked as a young adult on at least 2 campaigns that were grassroots in nature, that were focused on representation for Filipino American contributions and stories. One was the Filipino Memorial Project, which was a multi-year effort that brought in a broad base of community members and organizations, from Filipino seniors to educators and professors from community colleges in the area, to students such as myself, to Chicano community members who were like, we need to tell the stories of the Filipino farm workers that marched alongside Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. Their names were Larry Itliong and Philip Veracruz. They were the 2 union leaders that led the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, AWOC, and banded together with Dolores and Cesar and fought for fair working conditions and wages and led the grape strikes in 1965 in Delano. So I was a part of what I call that grassroots base building, where we would host meetings through the Filipino Memorial Project to one day have a mural depicting manongs. And manong is a Ilocano word, Ilocano being a Filipino language. Manong is the Ilocano word for like uncle, brother. It's sort of a flexible, you could say manong, but it's more uncle. But sometimes you say manong and you mean it as older brother. Anyway, you know how it goes sometimes. Because sometimes I'll call, as a term of respect, someone auntie, but she's not too much older than me. But she's not necessarily like a big sis, but she's more auntie. So it's one of those things. You know what I'm describing? But a mural to honor and depict manongs, Larry Itliong and Philip Veracruz, and their role in fighting for labor rights in this country for farm workers. And being 19 or 20 years old and part of those campaigns, seeing spats across community conversations. We would meet in any free space, whether or not that was the public library systems, at Jollibee, at Goldilocks. I remember a big blowout at Jollibee. One of our younger organizers, he was older than me though, younger, got in a fight with one of our triple OG activists, and they were yelling at each other, and that was the end of that meeting. But my role in these campaigns was always the student outreach component, because they saw me, this like bright-eyed and bushy-tailed 20-year-old. Send her to De Anza. Send her to San Jose City College. Have her take the bus over to Santa Clara University to get students to sign our petitions to get this mural happening. And guess what? The mural still stands at Milpitas Library, and my name is on that placard. And I got to meet Senora Dolores, which was amazing. And she came to the commissioning or the unveiling of the mural. It took 7 years. So I not only worked in professional nonprofit organizations, I always kind of rode that dual identity of organizing around issues of representation and justice. Yeah. When I took jobs at nonprofits, they were always jobs within either policy, organizing, or fundraising. And that's what I love that your podcast is high value discussions, because I always talk about high value skills. The high value skill set in any vertical you see yourself in is knowing how to get that bread, studying government contracts, understanding the inroads to philanthropy and foundations, understanding fee-based or value-based revenue models, studying operating models. How do you monetize or productize? And you can do this in a nonprofit organization. How do you monetize a workshop that you've developed that teaches about culturally responsive leadership practices and base building for a grassroots group that has a budget of $5? Because I've been there. Learning how nonprofits make money. Nonprofits make money just the same that private corporations do. It's just how we report that income to the IRS and the Franchise Tax Board. So I took roles in development. That's what they call it in nonprofit world. You might hear it as a grant writer. You might hear it as a grants administrator or a fund development strategist. But I worked in development. So after working with SVCN, where I was with Patty G for 4 years, at that point, she was like, "You've capped out here, girl. Like you're ready for the next thing," because SVCN was small, and she knew that I had already produced our largest event called Be Our Guest. I learned about ticket pricing and how to map that out, how to pursue corporate sponsorships, how to run the silent auction, and how to bring in the dollars through the auction piece. Every single aspect of the program had to be making money. Grant writing, grant reporting, compliance. So then I moved to LA. I moved to LA for love too. And I was in grad school studying public administration, because at the time I thought, the pinnacle of my career. I still wanted to start this amorphous thing called LEAD Filipino. But at the time, I was 25. I was like, all right, I've been in the Bay my whole life. I'm going to LA. I'm taking my talents to LA. And I was studying public administration because I, in my mind, thought one day I want to run a county department, a city or a county department, a public agency. And public administration is like an MBA, but for the public realm. And did my whole kind of advanced studies around public programs related to youth violence prevention and intervention, an evaluation study of impact. So I got really familiar when I worked for SVCN and my grassroots organizing in interacting with local government and the political relationships, as well as understanding the policy. You meet a lot of people who just do all the political and there's no depth there. They don't even know their bill numbers. They can't add. They don't know how to read a budget document. They don't know how to read a balance sheet. Like, what? And then you meet the people that are too policy focused, where they don't have soft skills. And they're like uncomfortable interacting with humans because they're so used to spreadsheets and percentages and formulas based on how they're looking at people's lives as numbers. And you know, behind the statistics, that's your mom, your dad, your grandma, your grandpa. I had a cousin who went through one of the programs, a workforce development program, because he was incarcerated. And I know the executive director of that organization. I was like, you know, you're helping my cousin. So you have people that lean kind of both, but having the dual lens, understanding that the relationships sometimes inform the policies. So I had that vocabulary and I had that working fluency, but I would always take jobs in the nonprofit world related to fundraising. And so when I went and worked for the California Immigrant Policy Center in LA as an MPA graduate student, I took a job for $16 an hour, man. What? As a development assistant for that organization. I get it. Nonprofit life is not for anybody. $16 an hour. For better or for worse, I wasn't driven and continue to be not too much driven by the dollars. However, there are other things that are driving me that connect back into the dollars. But I worked in development for this organization, but in the context of immigrant rights. And we were doing a lot of campaign work, but I was applying for grants. I was submitting our proposals. I was joining the executive director on pitch sessions with big philanthropic foundations, endowments. And so I'd say to anyone who wants to start a nonprofit organization, just like with anything, you want to start a consulting firm, you want to start a brand, you want to start an apparel company, you want to start a coffee shop or a juice shop. I have a lot of friends who are like restaurateurs. They worked in the restaurant industry. They washed dishes. They've done every single role you can think of. And that's my version in the nonprofit realm. Every single role: executive assistant, operations coordinator, campaign organizer, assistant policy director, internship manager. That's always fun. Grant writer, development assistant, investor relations. So understanding or having a working understanding of every reality that it'll take to build a functioning, healthy organization. Look, I'm not a marketer, but I know basic marketing strategies because I had to. I would not go promote myself as such, but I understand operations and administration because for the longest time in LEAD Filipino, I was the one administering all of our back of the envelope, procedures and systems, managing all of our spreadsheets that we're now converting into Salesforce. Also doubling up as our mouthpiece, as our ambassador of the organization. So all those realities, I think, creates such a deep and authentic appreciation for when you are no longer doing those roles, but you know if you need to because someone calls out or they quit on you and they're like, I'm out, you know what you got to do. And those have always been the leaders that I've had just the most profound respect for, that they are the first ones there and the last ones to leave, that they are willing to do the work that is not fashionable and won't be glorified, that it is part of the mission. And there are some young folks I've worked with through the years that wanted to organize with us because we were doing some deep work around public safety at the state level. So we were working with a family, the Quinto Collins family. Their son was having Angelo Quinto was having a mental health crisis. And in a moment where he needed de-escalation, he was unfortunately met with physical apprehension from 4 Antioch police officers. The family sued the city. Angelo lost his life. The family sued the city. There was a settlement, and the family also filed a federal civil rights suit, which they also won. So because of the work that we do at the depth and at the breadth, we get a lot of young folks that are like, I want to be a part of that. But they also don't understand that part of the mission of being a part of that is the spreadsheets, the checklists, the note-taking during meetings with the family so that we're accounting for all the action steps, the tracking government budgets, the tracking council meeting items so that we stay apace with particular campaign strategy. I had one student tell me, I didn't sign up for this internship to like make flyers and take notes. And I was like, what do you think organizing is? It's like 99% logistics, man, woman, sir, ma'am. I don't remember at the time. But I was flabbergasted. Like, what do you think this is? Like an Instagram organizer? We only have Instagram because the team now props us up. For me, I was that generation that missed the true appreciation. Obviously, I'm doing what I can now to like tell the story better and share these insights where they could be fruitful and helpful.
Our phone call a couple of weeks ago, something that caught my attention, I told you this off air before we started. You said that sentence where I didn't realize that I was an entrepreneur. And when I was conducting my research and prepping for this episode, the biggest thought to my head, I was kind of like, how can she not realize that she's an entrepreneur?
Yeah, I know.
So when did that switch hit for you personally, where you're like, oh, I'm not just this, I'm not just that, I'm not just that, I'm an entrepreneur?
I'd say within the past 2 to 3 years. It took a while because, well, there were a couple. So I'm a very reflective person. I overthink, which is why, because I'm aware of my shadow side traits, I push back against them because I'm hyper aware. But in my reflection, nothing is a coincidence. Some things are happenstance, but most, when you are truly aligned and you are paying attention and you are attuned to yourself, I realized that on both my mom and my biological dad's side, that I come from a family of entrepreneurs. It wasn't just a realization. I sat down with my mom's mom because she talked about, I was always curious about how the Dutch-Irish side ended up on the island of Guam. And my grandma told me about my great-grandmother and their family being seafarers that traveled all across the Pacific as Dutch traders of silk and textiles, and traveling all across and through Southeast Asia, lived in the Philippines, spent time in Indonesia, and eventually chose Guam. But that it was my great-grandmother who had the savvy and the business acumen to not only run kind of the trade routes, but help with the commerce, cultivating the relationships. And then on the island of Guam, had a whole like kind of mini fleet of cars that she ran as a taxi cab service. So I found that out later in my adulthood, But I'd say my foremost exposure was my grandma and my grandpa. So they were both brokers for different types of insurance. My late grandfather sold life insurance and burial insurance. And then my grandma was a real estate agent and a broker for insurance. So as a kid, when my mom was, at work, I would go with my grandparents and they would visit all their clients. And I remember at 6 or 7 years old wanting a briefcase like they carried. And my uncle, who lived with them, also is an entrepreneur and did mortgage lending and loans, also in real estate. But watching them create their own schedules and on the phones at their, home offices and the offices they rented, constantly busy, on the move, on the go, meeting with clients, prospecting, paying me $5 as an 8 or 9-year-old to help address envelopes and, at the time, fold paper and stuff the envelopes with basically bids for business. And me asking for a typewriter at 9 years old because I wanted to kind of play adult alongside them. Remember, I was the only kid and I was around these adults. And so that was like my social learning growing up, like everything centered around money, not necessarily impact, but money and conducting their daily activities of business. And I asked for a briefcase and they gave me one, and I asked for a calculator. I wasn't processing anything on that calculator, but it was all kind of for show because those were my examples. And you would think it would have stuck just because it was stuck in the way of the imprint that I would say I'm going to business school. But I think what I was also fighting with was that I also love drawing and painting and clay and sculpting. I was doing a lot of sculpting. So how that all kind of came together in this, a confluence of different experiences and memories and people. So that's just my mom's side. I would come to learn that on my biological father's side, before my grandma and grandpa Cortez immigrated from the Philippines to the United States, they ran a pawn shop. They not only had the pawn shop, I think my grandpa had some other business services. I think that he flipped cars. So he would buy cars and then sell them to aficionados. And then I think of the influence of even who is my dad, but he's my stepdad, and my grandpa being a business executive with Procter & Gamble. So all of these people in this power kind of just radiating in my environment. And part of that is how you're open to receiving. And I think at certain points in my life, when I was closeted, when I was moving based out of fear, when I was worried about getting outed by a cousin at a family party, I was closed off, I think, to some of that energy that was already in my orbit. But I also don't respond well when people say, do it this way. Like, I'm going to do it the way I please. Thank you. And I think I just had to go about life, explore my identity and who I was as a person first. Love and relationships. I learned a lot about who I was and what I liked and disliked through intimate partnerships, as I'm sure most of us could agree. Some of our biggest changes that have been instigated through discipline, routine, style, approach, opinions about culture and society have come from intimate relationships. I had to go do all that a little bit. And then I like school too, apparently. But I also think in my later years, going the distance in my education also came from overcompensating, because I felt, am I deficient because I'm a lesbian? Of course, my parents and my sisters are very loving and supporting and would deny that I'm deficient. But it was this inner, and I'm very fortunate, I want to say, that my family celebrates who I am. and has only shown love to the parts of who I am and who I've been with. And I know that's not the case for every LGBTQ plus community member when they consider safety and they consider, family dynamics. So I just want to honor that. But I do think going the full distance in schooling was this subconscious overcompensation for feeling like, am I letting them down?
Do you still feel that way?
No. Yeah. Took a long time.
Yeah.
I'm younger than I look. But I think back to your question, I see myself now as a social entrepreneur. It took a while to get there because I also came up in San Jose where the technological epicenter of the globe. And you're taught, and I would later push back and say we need to study other leaders who represent different emerging stories around entrepreneurship and impact, because you're taught, and rightfully so, the entrepreneurs that are praised and spotlighted are the Steve Jobs of the world, the Mark Cubans of the world, the Jeff Bezos. I'm not saying that, well, maybe I can say, I don't think my experience really mirrors theirs. I think it's helpful to see other folks that were not given a $300,000 kind of seed fund from their family to maybe make it an experiment. Nobody over here was giving me $300,000 to start maybe a successful venture. But my idea of an entrepreneur, my haphazard idea of one, was that you had to be in the tech space. You had to be very business driven, and you had to throw all caution to the wind and use your last $5 and lint in your pocket to go make the dream come true. And I just was not in that position. In terms of my economic situation and where my interests kept taking me. And it has always kind of landed back in the zone of the interconnected community impact with social change, with civics, and building political and electoral power. So I was like, I don't think I'm an entrepreneur. But it took, when I was living in LA, I attended and went through a 10-week program that was put on by SIPA, which is a Filipino nonprofit in historic Filipino town, a program dedicated to small business entrepreneurship. And I took it because at the time, I was already kind of conceptualizing this idea for LEAD Filipino. I had drawn the little logo. It has since morphed, but the original logo that I drew was a hand putting up an L. The Filipino word for people is why did I choose L? It might have been for leadership. It might have been for laban, but basically words and motifs around unity and people power. Went through this program and came out on the other end of it with a pamphlet that spoke to the 3 core areas that I wanted this organization to focus on. I have that pamphlet too. I'm keeping it forever. But that pamphlet gave me a physical representation of the vision that I had, and I started taking that pamphlet around when I moved back to San Jose after that time in LA to build buy-in for the folks that I would soon, host that first organizer roundtable with. Remember Jay Area testifying with the city of Milpitas? So I used that pamphlet. But it was through that program that the instructor, Anna Marie Cruz, who still runs all of her ventures, by the way, MBA, she was like, you're an entrepreneur, right? I was like, no, I still have a job. I still work at the Immigrant Policy Center. I just have an idea. I haven't built anything. She was like, no, you are. And that sat with me for years. Obviously, this story I'm telling is from 2013.
Crazy though, right? How it all, like that one simple sentence from somebody else telling you. And then the time that we have to put in to actually have that realization in ourselves, not with somebody else telling us. Like when we're by ourselves and we're dissecting and reflecting, we're like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
It's such a weird thing. Like even to this day that happens, but it's nice to know when you find out with yourself, not with anybody else. It's nice getting the compliments from somebody else, but when you get to have that realization with yourself, that's powerful.
Because anyone can share with how they view you, how they perceive you. But if you don't see it when you look in the mirror, what does it matter what anyone else believes? And that's the parallel with confidence. I need to believe that we are going to grow this organization, that we have a unique value proposition, and we have impact before anybody else in that room. And I need to believe it to the upteenth power that we will do those things. And I'd say there was another defining moment where I sat down and I was like, all right, I guess I am entrepreneurial. But for me, it's about being entrepreneurial as a vehicle for justice, as a vehicle for community activism. So for me, that is more how I started building my comfort around that. Now, when people introduce me and they're like, nonprofit founder, social entrepreneur, I'm like, yes. But it took my own sort of inner self-development and piecing together a definition that felt aligned with how I spend my time 7 days a week. But it was when I started my social enterprise called Fancy Heads. And Fancy Heads came out of, with me, nothing is linear with me. And it might drive people crazy who are very logic-based, very driven by a sequence. For me, everything's a loop-de-loo. Everything's iterative. The creative process is, I trust the process. Sometimes it's like zigzaggy. So Fancy Heads came from, in 2023, I spent a total of 5 weeks in Indonesia. Before I left for the first leg of that trip, I was cleaning out my closet, spring cleaning. I'd always known that I had this unhealthy affinity for headwear and hats. I always have something on my head. It could be a fedora, it could be a bucket cap, a dad cap, trucker hat, my head wraps if I have my hair up. So I was cleaning everything out and I was like, goodness, I need a larger container for all of my headwear. Didn't think much of that. Went to Indonesia, completely disconnected. Even when I bought a SIM card, it wasn't really working. And just in the natural environment, sitting at the beach, watching the water, in the jungles. And because it's so hot all the time, it's just, that is my preferred climate. Outside, staring at the stars, no light pollution. Just very open in terms of disconnection, reducing my stress, freeing my mind from all the worries and concerns back home with my 2 jobs, because that's the other part of this journey. I've always had another job as I've built LEAD Filipino. And when we would go shopping during the day or go exploring across different parts of, we were in central Indonesia and Yogyakarta. We spent time in Bali, and then we were in kind of the adjacent little villages and communities there. I started picking up textiles, and you can't really see it, but I'm covered in, I love my artwork. So I'm covered in.
It's a nice sleeve.
Thank you. Thank you. It is batik inspired floral designs that I started studying when I first went to Malaysia and the Philippines back in 2016. So I started drawing my own designs, and then I got them put on me permanently. But during that trip in Indonesia, picking up the textiles and getting reacquainted with batik and drawing my own batik on my iPad. I started drawing floral designs. And because I was watching online just different thoughts and approaches to entrepreneurship and creating multiple streams of income, I was just so enticed by that. For some reason, I didn't think 2 jobs was enough. And I drew a flower. It's one of my best-selling designs now. It's called the Flower Crown. It combines the Philippines' national flower with Malaysia's national flower. So it's a sampaguita and a hibiscus called the Flower Crown. And I had this idea to put this design on a hat. So I looked up like wholesalers, bought a bunch of blank trucker hats. And because through LEAD Filipino, we put on so many community events, festivals, conferences, workshops. There was our summer Jeepney Jam, which is actually coming up on Friday, June 6th. I had all these hats printed and stitched with my design, and I sold everything. And the original name was Heads of State. I sold 50 of what I would call my fancy crowns at that event of my original artwork. I made my money back from all the blanks. The embroidery is expensive though. So I started like tinkering. Okay, how do I get these margins super, how do I redo this equation so that I'm driving my costs down and obviously increasing my profit? And how can then I set up the online store. And anyhow, Heads of State was taken. Shout outs to the very clever hat shop in New York that took Heads of State. But because my nickname was Fancy Gels, and it still is Fancy Gels because I always dress up, I was like, Fancy Heads. Because people always call me a bookhead because I'm nerdy and I like knowledge. So I thought, Fancy Heads. That's the name with the Z at the end because of my last name, Cortez. And Fancy Heads is my social enterprise. Got the LLC set up. I've now popped up at over 40 events. I've done collaborative events out in Seattle and San Antonio. I've sold in Vegas, and I just write it off. But Fancy Heads right now there's a lot of potential there. But I have my online store.
You're going to see me on one of the episodes where I'm going to be wearing it.
Oh my goodness. I'll just give you one for free.
I got you.
I
can't do that. I personally cannot do that. Okay. If I see, like, say, a buddy of mine, he's an author, and he gave me one of his books, came on the podcast, phenomenal human being, and I bought the book. I'm like, bro, I'm not going to just take this from you. Regardless, it's like we are an exchange of value to each other. Like you are being very valuable to me here. So it's like the way I pay that for is like, oh my God, not with one, give me a few hats so I can just pass them around.
That's what's up. Thank you. So Fancy Heads online store. I try to pop up monthly. Right now I'm busy. But I will have a stand at Jeepney Jam, and I will be debuting some of my 2025 products. The whole premise of Fancy Heads is actually as a couple, but the mission of Fancy Heads is to spread awareness about the Malay archipelago. When you look at the map of Southeast Asia, the Malay archipelago is comprised of 3 countries, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia. When you look at the physical attributes, the qualities, the characteristics of the people of these 3 countries, we look like each other. We're like cousins. So when I had the privilege of traveling across these countries, and I have friends in all of them, I started questioning, like, I'm in Malaysia, but I look like you, but you are a Muslim woman. You're wearing a hijab. I'm covered in tattoos. You can clearly tell I'm from the West. So that uncovered just my nerdy self, the cultural anthropology and the history. And we do share genetic traits and characteristics. It was just through migration patterns and then different colonial kind of powers that came in, the Dutch in Indonesia, the Brits in Malaysia, Spaniards in the Philippines, and then the Americans. So there's actually the national hero of the Philippines, Dr. Jose Rizal. He did a lot of research and published commentary around uniting the Malay people. So he has this whole, set of publications around uniting Malays, and that we had artificial boundaries placed against us because of colonial influences. And then back in the 60s, there was a movement to unite these three countries for economic purposes, for militaristic strategy, for commerce. And there was an actual convention held in Borneo in Indonesia with the three heads of state of those countries, Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia. And they created the first Southeast Asian superstate called Ma-Philindo, combining all their names. Ma-Philindo was basically a failed idea because they all couldn't get out of the way of each other. But Ma-Philindo took place in 1962. And it basically was the predecessor to the ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. So their version of the EU, a representative council of these countries coming together for shared interests and the well-being of their people. So with Fancy Heads, it's about spreading awareness through symbolism, florals. I do a lot of cosmological stuff in there, a lot of stars, a lot of, but different cultural motifs. So every piece that you buy comes with a card that tells you about the design. And then part of my time in Indonesia was textiles. So I have a bunch of batik-inspired headwear. I have 5 panels, I have baseball caps, and all the money that I bring in quarterly, I donate. Right now, I have one partner in Cebu in the Philippines. I actually was able to go there in December. They're a youth drop-in center for mental behavioral health. Fancy Heads is about your mental wellness and your mental health. So I visited with their clinicians and their staff. Even, Daniel, if I have a rough quarter and I'm only able to send $5 back to this agency, they said $5 for them can cover all the calling cards for their counselors for a month, especially if they get a youth who calls in crisis. They get a lot of youth teen pregnancies where they're getting kicked out of their homes, a lot of violence. So that's when I knew. I was like, okay, this girl has this is me talking to myself. This girl has 2 jobs. She's growing LEAD Filipino, has part-time staff, has a whole 9-to-5 job, and still wanted to start a whole social enterprise. Why? What is wrong? And that's when I knew. I was like, okay, I have a lot of interest.
Yes. We just went an hour and 40 minutes.
Wait, are you for real?
I'm dead serious. You were going, girl. I wasn't not keeping track of time at all.
I thought about that. I was like, maybe it's been an hour-ish.
We're approaching 2 hours.
Okay, I don't want to be that dude.
You are smooth. Like I prefer long form conversations rather than just like a quickie. I don't like that. I personally do not like that. But
sorry.
No, honestly, because I'm just also letting you know that this is just part 1. We're going to be doing this however many times that you personally want. If you want twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5, no matter what, I'm around here. And if you ever need to promote something, you want a team in here, so on and so forth, and we want to have a group podcast, we totally can.
That'd be dope, actually.
Future options for sure. But I have one more question for you, okay? So you have been through a lot of rooms. You have seen people who are very, very successful, and you yourself are very, very successful. And everybody has their own definition of success. But for you personally, how would you define success?
That's a changing definition and a moving target. I'd say 6 months ago, success for me was being able to do whatever I wanted every single day. If I want to start my day at noon, because I want the first part of my day dedicated to exercising, journaling, meditating. For me at that point in time, success was not answering to anybody. And then, obviously, as I'm making these transitions, leaving my 9-to-5 comfort, I could ride off into the sunset with this agency that I am gainfully employed by right now and wouldn't worry about a thing. I would be coasting. They take care of me. I am compensated very well. But I was bored to tears. I felt like I would die on the vine there. I didn't feel alive. I wasn't buzzing. I wasn't vibrating at that higher level. It felt rote. It felt basic. So for me, success now is I get to live my version of what I've been talking about since I was 20 years old and didn't have the language for. Could not understand what I was feeling, but it was my body, it was my mind, and it was my soul trying to come through to show me, remember who you are. Don't be afraid of yourself. Don't get in the way of yourself. Use your voice. So every loop-de-loo, 10 steps back, missteps, all has come together for this moment. And for me, this is success. Even if, and I always have to argue that the worst case scenario could happen. And that's just my campaign political brain that shows her face, which is you got to think about 10 different scenarios when you're doing active planning and preparation. Where I'm okay with outcomes A, B, C, or D, I would prefer outcome A. But for me, success, even if I can't raise one more penny for my nonprofit organization, at least I am giving it my all. And for me, that is success. That an organization that has been supported and poured into by hundreds, if not thousands of people by this point, that I'm going to have the opportunity to be that CEO that takes us to our greatest heights and deepest depths. Because for LEAD Filipino, it's not necessarily about scale. It's about penetrating deep, about building the roots. You talked a lot about my resume. For me, it has always been about building the root, not necessarily the resume. That always came later. It's terrible. And me walking away from a job right now that pays me really good money to go roll the dice on myself, that's success. I am not scared. I'm cautiously optimistic. I am not scared. I am very energized by that fear because that's the fire. And I have to try. There is no way I would want to look at myself every morning like, okay, sell out. All right, girl. Taking the easy path that everyone else takes. And I want to help others. When LEAD Filipino buys a building, when we own multiple buildings, when we incorporate our other ventures and our entities to further and spread our mission, I want to help others. I want to be in a position where not just nonprofit leaders, but also when I think about my micro business and I think about small business owners, if I'm ever in a position, and I will be, my money's in escrow, she's waiting for me, I will invest if I believe in you and I believe in your heart and I see that you have discipline and you are focused and you're not, drinking every single day, you are going to sleep early, you are taking care of yourself. If I see those habits and those structures, I would love to be in a position in sort of the next level of who I am to invest in others. But for me right now, success is that I'm going to go do what I've dreamt of since I was 20.
Angelica, this is the first time we are meeting and it is a true honor for me. I'm really, really grateful for this time. And I cannot wait for part 2, part 3, part 4, etc.
Thank you, Daniel.
I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you all for tuning in to today's episode. If you got a lot of value out of this, please do me a favor and support our channel by liking, commenting, and subscribing. Make sure to hit that follow button on Spotify to stay updated with our latest episodes. And if you are listening on Apple Podcasts, I would greatly appreciate it if you would leave a 5-star rating, followed by with a review. Again, thank you all for the support. Stay loving, stay hungry, and stay excellent.